Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Happy Monday. You're in for a treat. On behalf of the board, its faculty, staff, the Concert and Lecture Series Committee, it's indeed a pleasure. My name is Frank Chong. I'm the superintendent president of this great college, and I'd like to welcome students, faculty, members of the community to this wonderful opportunity. This is one of the events that's going to help highlight Women's History Month. And we have a bunch of great events happening, and you can look it up on our website, and this is one of them. And the history of this event came out of a conversation I had with my assistant, Erin McGee. Erin has been working with me for about 2 or 3 years now, and one of her claim to fame was she held the world record for open dive. 266 feet she went down without tanks or oxygen, held her breath, went down 266 feet, had to come back up and still count to 10 and be coherent, which is probably the difference of what her 266 feet would have been to my 26 feet. But Erin is really well noted and has a great reputation in the open dive community, and she said, Dr. Chong is a friend of mine, Don Kernagis, who's a scientist and has done some pretty amazing things. And I said, that would be a wonderful person to bring here because many people have an interest in the ocean, in the environment, in science. And, you know, lately with the Hidden Figures, the movie, how many have seen Hidden Figures? I'm going to see it tonight. It's a great movie. So, again, I think this is an untold story of the emergence of women in the science and STEM fields. We have our Dean of STEM here today, Victor Tam. So we're trying to break barriers here at the college. That's the great thing about the JC. It's an opportunity for us to really explore careers that you might not have thought that it was in your interests. So we're here to broaden you out today, and I'm going to ask Erin to come up to introduce our speaker today. So please join me in welcoming Erin McGee.
Hello, I'm so excited to welcome you all here today to hear this talk from Don Kernagis. A couple quick things about the presentation. Dawn's going to present for about 50 minutes, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So feel free to think of those questions as she's talking, and we'll address those at the end. And if y'all wouldn't mind just taking a moment to check your phones, making sure everything's either on silent or off so we don't interrupt the presentation. So I am so excited to introduce Dr. Don Kernagis, someone who I'm very proud to call a friend of mine, and who I think really exemplifies what Women's History Month is about. And to give you some background on her, she has a PhD from Duke University as ONR Undersea Medicine's first pre-doctoral award recipient. She obtained her undergraduate degree in biochemistry at North Carolina State University, and before pursuing her PhD, she held an internship at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. On top of that, she's an avid diver and has led numerous underwater explorations, research, and conservation projects around the world since 1993. It's actually how I met her. She was doing research on the effects of deep diving on freedivers and how that affected our physiology. She also did exploration of the, you can tell me if I'm saying this wrong, Don, the Wakula Springs, Wakula Springs, and surrounding caves for over a decade. Last year, in 2016, she was inducted into the Women Divers Hall of Fame. And in that same year, she was selected as one of 6 crew to join NASA's 21st undersea mission, the NEEMO project that she's going to tell us about today. So, oh, and one more thing that I found out this weekend is Dawn is shortly going to be applying to be in the next cohort of NASA astronauts. So, if you wouldn't mind helping me, welcome.
Thank you, Erin. What Erin didn't mention is there were 18,000 applicants this last round for 8 spots. So it's a long shot, but I'm at least going to try. I'll put my hat in the ring. So it's really interesting, just as an aside, I was looking at this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures from the mission. I've got lots of great pictures through this presentation. But thinking about the theme of Women's History Month, this picture, so that's me on the left, and on the right is our commander, Megan Benkin. And Megan was a shuttle astronaut. And she has her PhD in oceanography from Scripps and was actually the last human to touch the Hubble telescope, so she operated the robotic arm that fixed the Hubble telescope. So when you talk about amazing careers, right there I'm standing next to a woman who exemplifies exactly what you were talking about. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me out. It's fantastic. It's been a wonderful visit. I did not see sunny California per se. It's my first time here. I've been here since Friday, or at least since Sonoma County since Friday evening. But I did get a double rainbow on Saturday, and we got snow yesterday, which I'm in Florida right now, so that was great. That was better than sun, so I get plenty of sun in Florida. So right now I'm a research scientist at an institute, nonprofit academic institute in Florida called the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. And the focus of my research is on human performance and optimization in extreme environments. So in other words, I get to work with scuba divers, particularly Navy divers, high altitude aviators, different pilots, people working in mountains, and also astronauts, and help them perform to the best of their ability in those environments, in those extreme environments. But I'm not going to talk about my research specifically today. What I'm going to talk about is a project that I had the chance to work with last summer. And this started off as me just having a research project with them. I was going to study astronauts who were living underwater, and we were talking about my research project. It was about this time last year, maybe a few months before. And we're on the phone with each other, we're going over details of what I needed for blood sampling and some other stuff. And the mission director said, so what do you think about diving this project? And I was like, man, I've been diving for over 20 years. I've known people to somehow get into the NEEMO mission to dive, not as crew, but just as support. It's kind of this black box thing. You just get invited, out of nowhere. So I was like, man, I'll dive, I'll cook, I'll clean, I'll carry tanks, I'll do whatever you guys want me to do. And he said, actually, we're thinking about you as crew. And for the next few minutes, he and this other director for the project were on the phone with me, like, it's going to be the experience of a lifetime. And they were convincing me, trying to convince me to join. And I finally spoke up and I was like, no, I just had to pick my job off the floor. Absolutely, I will join you guys. It's not a question at all. So I'm going to talk to you today about what NEEMO is, why NASA does this mission every year, what we do during NEEMO, and what we do to train to prepare to live underwater and to work underwater for anywhere from about a week to 2 weeks. So what is NEEMO? So NEEMO, one of my really good friends jokes around that NASA always comes up with really good acronyms, really creative acronyms, and this is another shining example. So NEEMO stands for NASA Extreme Environment Missions Operation. And this is a project where they send astronauts to live underwater for anywhere from a week to 2 weeks at a time, and they test out protocol and software and hardware and things that are either being sent to the International Space Station or up for long-duration space missions. So planetary exploration, for example, like a Mars mission. So this is a place where they can use this as a test bed for a number of different reasons. There are different types of remoteness that we're experiencing as a crew. So physiological remoteness, which I'll talk about in a second. Psychological remoteness, because you're living underwater away from all these other people, and then and also just living in a small crew quarters with a crew and having to work around each other. There's a huge stress that's associated with that that's very similar to being in space, and also a physical remoteness, so you're just kind of packed away from everybody. So every once in a while, to make it more interesting, they send a scientist or an engineer, sometimes a couple of us, to live with those astronauts just to make it more interesting and see if we can survive in that environment too. So luckily this mission we had 3 astronauts and we had 3 non-astronauts that were working on this past mission. This is the 21st mission, as Aaron mentioned, and so they've been doing this since 2000, so there are a couple of years where they did multiple missions, but they tend to usually do about 1 a year. So NEEMO would not be possible without the collaboration of Aquarius Reef Base, and this is a facility that's located in the Florida Keys, and it is owned and operated by Florida International University. So Aquarius Reef Base entails the underwater habitat that we actually live in, undersea. The shore base, so this is a place where all the personnel live, this is where the boats are kept, all the equipment's kept, and shore base actually turns into a makeshift mission control during the NEEMO mission. So that's really interesting to kind of see that whole process take place as they transform it into mission control. I will say that NEEMO is not the only mission that's run at Aquarius Reef Base, so they tend to have anywhere from about 5 to 10 projects or so a year. Some of these are education projects, some are scientific projects. So anytime they're running a mission there, they have 24/7 watch at the watch desk at the shore base to make sure that the people who are living undersea are protected and being looked after the whole time. They have a life support buoy, so this is a buoy that sits above the habitat, floats above the habitat where we're living, and that provides all the power, and it provides communication, including internet, which is great if you're a crew member, because they did not always have that, so definitely made our lives easier in a lot of ways. Dive fleet, so they have about 6 boats that run back and forth from the shore base out to the habitat and take people out and equipment and everything that's needed. And then the support staff and equipment itself. And I'll say, hands down, like I said, I've been diving for over 20 years, working on a lot of projects around the world. This is the most professional team of people that I've ever had the opportunity to work with in that kind of environment, in this operational environment. They're all former Navy divers or former commercial divers, so safety and efficiency is key for these guys, and making sure that everybody is doing things in the best way possible, but also in the safest way possible. And they're really, really good instructors in teaching us what we need to know to stay safe undersea. So this is just a map just to give you an idea. So it's about an hour-and-a-half drive south of Miami. Has anybody here been to the Florida Keys? Yeah, so it's a beautiful, beautiful place to live. And so we're living in an island called Isla Morada. So you can see the shore base is over here to the left-hand side. And Aquarius Reef Base is about 6 miles offshore. So it's about a 30-minute boat ride from shore base, or about a 16-minute boat ride if you're lucky enough to get on the fast boat. So you put in bribes to try to get on the fast boat if you can. But it's just far enough offshore where we have that kind of isolation and seclusion. We're sitting right on a bank, and then it drops off to about 100 feet where we're living. And so that gives us a chance to go and do deep work instead of trying to just stay shallow for the stuff that we're doing. So this is the actual habitat itself. And so it's about the size of an Airstream trailer, and on the front end, you can see that's where we go in and out of the habitat. I'm going to show you a video in a second that shows the full tour inside the habitat so you can see where we were living. So it sits about 62 feet on the ocean bed. We're living at about 50 feet. So one thing that's different about this compared to living in a submarine you're protected against that external pressure. You're still at 1 atmosphere, just like we are in this room right now. Here, we're living at 50 feet, so we're actually equilibrated to the outside pressure. So this is just like scuba diving. We're diving essentially for 8 days. We're living at 50 feet. So does anybody in here scuba dive? So you know that when you're diving, you take up inert gas into your blood and tissues. So if you've ever heard of the bends or decompression sickness in scuba divers, that's because you have this nitrogen taken up into your blood and tissues, and when you come up, there's a chance that that nitrogen can come out in a bubble formation and create a sickness or a syndrome. So the thing about living at 50 feet for 8 days is that you get to a place where at about 24 hours where you're saturated. Your tissues and your blood are completely saturated with nitrogen. It's great for doing work outside the habitat, because then from that point on, once you're saturated, you can do dives outside of the habitat at 50 feet or deeper, not too deep, but within about a 50-foot range, so out to about 100 feet, without any kind of time constraints. So we could go out and do working dives for 6 hours at 100 feet. As long as we had the air supply, which we had a continuous air supply that ran back to the habitat that I'll show you in a second as well. So essentially, we could go out and do these long excursions just like the astronauts do when they go into space. So they go and do these spacewalks that are about 4 to 6 hours and do repair on the International Space Station. So they want to be able to simulate that same kind of physical stress, the psychological stress, and the tasking that the astronauts experience when they're doing these spacewalks. So you kind of get a feel for the layout of the habitat. The little white gazebo that you can see up on the front, a couple purposes for that. So one is if there's an emergency. So I was talking before about the remoteness. So there's that psychological remoteness, there's a physical remoteness, and then that's a physiological remoteness that if we have an emergency, we can't come straight to the surface. Because we're saturated, we have to deal with everything down there. If you were to shoot straight to the surface, there's a really good chance you're going to die because the bubbles would be so overwhelming, your body just can't handle it. So if there's an emergency, we can use that white gazebo as an exit place. So essentially, we would take a small bottle, swim out, duck in there, it's air-filled, and just kind of hang out and wait for the rescue team, and they have a rescue protocol in place to get us up safely. It takes about 15 hours to come up from 50 feet to the surface safely based off of all that nitrogen that's in our blood and tissues. So there's a way that they can do that if there's an emergency. So the gazebo can be used for emergencies. It used to also be the bathroom. I say used to, because it was not the bathroom on our mission. So they told us before we started our training, they said, okay, for the bathroom, you guys are gonna have to have a mask and fins and swimsuit, boots. I was like, okay, I get the boots, because you don't wanna walk on the sea urchins that are on the grating below. You want a mask on so you can kind of duck under and not get salt water in your eyes. Swimsuit makes sense. Why the fins? You're not swimming. You're like literally ducking from that little ledge over into the gazebo and back. And they said the fins are to beat off the fish who know exactly why you're there to use the bathroom. They started having a lot of bite injuries, and so they nixed the whole idea of using that as a bathroom. So they ended up installing a toilet for our mission, which we were all very, very happy about. We were not arguing that at all. So I'm going to show you a tour that was done by a previous mission a couple of years ago. It's called Sea Test, but it's just another name for NEEMO because of some politics that were going on. But essentially, these astronauts did a really good job of showing you what it looks like to swim up into the habitat and then all the way back through to the bunk room.
Tuesday evening, we're in the habitat under the sea. That can only mean one thing: the mission has started. Let's meet the crew.
Hey there, I'm Joe McCava. I'm a NASA astronaut and commander for Sea Test 2.
Hey, Soichi Noguchi from JAXA. Good to be back in the weightlifting.
Kate Rubens, NASA astronaut, and I'm pretty happy to be here.
And I'm Andy from ESA, and we're really excited, all of us, to start the Sea Test mission. And we welcome you to the habitat Aquarius. Let's take a tour. This is the entry porch with the moon pool. As you can see down here behind me, this is where we enter and exit the habitat from. This is where we store our diving equipment. This is where we have all of the air connections. And it also serves up as our shower. Next we get to the entry lock, which serves as an airlock with the two slidable doors. It also has a hygiene station where we can brush our teeth. And most importantly, our comm station where we can talk to the divers who are out on EVA, and with Mission Control Center topside. Stepping further into the habitat, we get to the galley where we can prepare our food. We have a small table for eating where Soichi and Kate are sitting. Hey guys.
Hi.
And all the electronics for controlling the habitat. And last but not least, we have our bunk room with 6 bunks for the 6 people on board Aquarius. There's not a lot of room, as you can see, but plenty for sleeping.
That's one of my favorite views because we all aimed our beds so that we were looking out that bow window that you just saw. So you see all kinds of interesting creatures swimming by you at night. Sometimes it was a little disconcerting to see some of the things that swam by, but you knew you were protected at least. But one night I woke up and I saw a very large fish hanging out outside the window and just floating there watching us. I was like, I'm not sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it was a pretty cool thing to take a picture of. So it was one of my favorite memories actually from the mission. So to do this, to live underwater and to work underwater is obviously going to take a fair bit of training. So they told us that we had to report to Johnson Space Center for training, for crew training in June of last year. I will tell you, as a non-astronaut, you felt pretty cool to be reporting to Johnson Space Center for crew training, but it was fantastic. So a big part of that was meeting your fellow crew members. We didn't know each other at that time. None of us knew each other, but we were going to be living and working together and training together for about 6 weeks total. We had team introductions, so there are over 150 people that ended up working with this mission over the course from start to finish. So we met a lot of the people who are going to have their hands in some of the research projects and operations and dive support throughout the mission. So we just started to meet some of them at Johnson Space Center. We did mission overview, safety training, lots of paperwork signing, as you can imagine, doing a mission like this, so signing your life away. Classroom training for mission objectives. So we had 18 research projects that we were running over the course of the mission. And this is both for NASA and for the Navy and some other collaborators that were involved. So we just started to get our hands on some of the equipment we're going to be using and going through some of the protocol that we're going to be using, because there's just a lot to remember before we go and live undersea and try to go through all these objectives. A big one was DNA extraction. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it was pretty cool to be able to extract and sequence DNA undersea. We were the first ones to do that. So that was a pretty cool project as someone with a biomedical and biochemistry background who did a lot of that in labs that were a lot less interesting than NEEMO, or Aquarius Reef Base. I put in review of Microsoft Word, and I thought it was really funny that we had to go through that, but they wanted to make sure that we could actually operate the laptops that they had down there for us, and they're all running on MS Word 8.0, so they just wanted to make sure that we can actually function while we're down there. CPR, first aid, oxygen administration, so essentially any kind of emergencies. We could deal with a lot of that down there ourselves or with the habitat technicians that we had. We did have a physician who was on site throughout the entire mission, though, in case there was an emergency. And then a swim test, so they wanted to make sure we wouldn't drown if they threw us in the water, which is important. But so they told us we're going to do the swim test, and we're like, okay, we'll do it at some YMCA or something. They're like, no, actually, you get to do it at the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. So the Neutral Buoyancy Lab at Johnson Space Center is where the astronauts train for spacewalks. They train for their extravehicular activity, or otherwise known as EVA. Essentially, it's a 45-foot deep pool that has the entire mock-up of the International Space Station in the pool. And so the astronauts go in full suits like they would for a spacewalk and step through all the different procedures that they're going to do on a spacewalk, and they do this over and over and over again. So by the time they get to space, it's kind of second nature. They've stepped through all this stuff. They know where the handholds are and how the equipment's going to run and whatnot. So we found out that we got to do our swim test in here. And I can tell you, it's really hard to not smile so much that you're going to almost drown when you're swimming over that. But it was really neat to have a chance to kind of do our drown-proofing testing and do our swim tests in there and just get a chance to see it firsthand and meet some of the astronauts who were actually training on it that day. And I talked about the crew. Probably one of the most important things is, do we get along and get a chance to know each other? And hands down, the best operational crew I've ever had the chance to work with, and they did a really good job selecting everybody this time. We just happened to get along really, really well. We still talk this day like on a daily basis. So it's me on the left. Behind me in the green shirt is Dr. Marco Grifa. He's an Irish physician who does biomedical research, and he and I had some projects that were kind of tagged up together throughout the course of the mission. Behind him is Noel Dutoy, and Noel is actually in Monterey, and he was working with the Naval Postgraduate School doing underwater robotics, and he's actually now just transitioned over to work for Apple, but at the time he was with Naval Postgraduate School, and he actually had a study doing human-robot interactions underwater over the course of the NEEMO mission, and had worked with previous NEEMO missions doing that same thing. To his left, in the back, is Matthias Maurer. Matthias is a European Space Agency astronaut, and he's also a biomechanical engineer. And he has been going through his training to become an astronaut, so he was going through his Russian language training and some other things while we were there training together in the Florida Keys. So it was pretty interesting just to see what he had to go through as he was becoming an astronaut. And then our two commanders who are next to me up front, that's Reed Wiseman. Reed was a Navy pilot, and he is an astronaut now with NASA. He was on the International Space Station for 6 months in 2014, and is an incredible leader. Can't say enough about him as far as his commanding skills go. And then Megan MacArthur-Benkin, who I talked about earlier, who's just amazing and incredible as a shuttle astronaut and also just as a leader. So between the two of them, we had great leadership throughout the entire mission, and we all learned a lot from them. So we moved about 4 weeks later, we went down to the Florida Keys, and so we showed up at shore base and started doing some of our training. So some of that's just basic scuba checkout dives and getting an idea of, are we comfortable enough in the water with the equipment that we're wearing, and doing some more classroom training for those mission objectives I was telling you about. Like I said, we had about 18 mission objectives, so we wanted to make sure that we could get more practice on everything before we actually went undersea. Signing more paperwork, as you can imagine, and then meeting the rest of the team. I said 70 plus for support and research. That was just on the research side alone. Then there's dive support, operational support, everything else. Like I said, over 150 people they counted over the course from start of training all the way to the end of the mission. So just getting to know people, and again, not just our crew, but the team is just fantastic to work with. I can't say enough great things. This is actually a photo that was sent to us from one of the astronauts who's on the International Space Station while we were in the Florida Keys doing our training. Yeah, so kind of. So we were kind of, I think it's like right around here. And so it was really cool. We got it in our email from space, and they sent this to the crew. And I think all of us have it blown up now somewhere in our offices. So I thought that was pretty fantastic for them to say, hey, we're checking in on you guys, and we can see you down there. So we showed up at shore base. This is the place I was telling you about where they had the makeshift mission control and all the personnel and equipment stored. We were all really excited. We started doing our training. One of the biggest things that we had to train on was the hard hat system that we were diving. So I was telling you about doing these dives outside the habitat where you don't have time restrictions because of the decompression obligation, but you still have to have that continuous air supply or have enough gas, obviously, while you're out there doing the dives. So we had these hard hat systems that we were wearing that essentially allowed us to, one, have real-time communication with each other underwater so we could talk to each other all we needed to, We could talk back to the habitat, so we could actually talk with what we called IV comms, so that's intravehicular comms. They have the same setup when they do spacewalks. So they have somebody inside the habitat or inside the space station talking to the guys that are doing, or girls who are doing the spacewalk. So that was one thing, but then we also, in those umbilicals that followed behind us, we had our air supply. And essentially we had pretty much everything we needed. Continuous air supply. You see a tank on our back. The only reason we have a tank on our back is for emergency purposes. If that line were to get cut, then we have something to help us get back to safety, essentially, just enough to get us back to safety. None of us had ever dove these hard hat systems. I'll tell you that they're heavy. They're really fun to dive once you get to know them and get comfortable with them, but they're about 55 pounds, and when you're sitting, and they're stainless steel, so when you're sitting in the sun in a rocking boat, like in the middle of the Florida Keys in July, wearing that, plus the wetsuits, which are not the most comfortable, it's daunting, but I'll tell you that diving out of the habitat was a lot easier, because we could get the hats on and pretty much just kind of slide out of the habitat. We didn't have to worry about rocking on a boat with these big heavy helmets on. But a lot of it was learning safety checks and learning what valve does what on the helmet, and how to communicate with each other. It's very short communication, just like any kind of operational scenario. You don't want to be talking a lot, because then you're going to talk over each other and you're going to miss information. So just learning some of those basics throughout the course of our training there. So just more pictures of us. Like I said, it was heavy, so they were nice enough to help us and kind of relieve some of the weight and the strain while we were wearing those helmets. And this is us training. That's me on the right, and I'm laughing because I'm giving our dive supervisor, who's an incredibly experienced Navy master diver, I'm giving him the look like, please just let me get in the water at this point. And I'll tell you, one of the interesting drills that we had to do when we were doing this training is, and it was the one that everybody who had done the training before us, they said, this is the thing that scared us the most. And so we all came into it going, oh no, we know we have to do this. You have to flood the helmet. So essentially it's a neck ring, it's a metal neck ring, and then the helmet locks into that. So once it's on, you can't take that off, like you're in the helmet. So one of the things they teach you to do, just to get comfortable with the helmet and say, okay, worst case scenario, that helmet floods, you can handle this. And so they had us flood the helmet, and you open up the neck dam and let water fill in, and it fills the whole thing up. It's like sticking your head in a locked-in aquarium. I don't know how to compare it to anything else, but we were all nervous, even the astronauts. We were all a little bit nervous about this. But once we did it, there's a valve you turn, it blasts air in there, blows the water out, you're done, you're fine. But I'll tell you, there's a psychological component to that. But a lot of that, after we did that training, was we were comfortable with that equipment. So that's part of the whole process, right? Just getting comfortable with everything so you just can handle things when you have some kind of issue. So there's just more pictures of us doing the dive training and having a lot of fun with it. And this is probably one of my favorite pictures from my diving career, actually. My dive buddy on one of the training dives got this picture of me, but it gives you an idea of what the setup looks like. So we were all walking. We were weighted so that we could simulate partial microgravity. And so we would, instead of swimming with fins, especially with those heavy helmets, it's almost impossible to do that. So we were walking along the bottom, weighted out just enough, and you can see the umbilicals. We had about 400 feet of umbilicals that we had to manage, and there was a way that they kept all those kind of roped in so they didn't float off and get caught in the coral or get caught around other divers. So we did hands-on classroom training, as I was talking about before. So this is just one of the projects that we were working on called the Coral Restoration Foundation. And I'll have some more pictures from underwater on this, but essentially they're building coral trees to help grow these coral seedlings that they have, and then they harvest those seedlings and plant them in areas where coral's been decimated. And this is a really, really cool project. It's probably one of the favorite ones that we worked on, because you feel like you're giving back in that way. You're not decimating the coral around you, you're actually trying to rebuild. And so they're working on this. It's a nonprofit out of the Florida Keys, and they're doing this in the Florida Keys and the Caribbean and the Bahamas, and now they're starting to spread to other parts of the world. So it's pretty cool to be part of that project and get to learn what they're doing and try to help them in any way we could. We worked with the Florida International University Marine Science Program. So part of when we did the excursions outside the habitats, we were testing technology that NASA had developed for planetary exploration. But we did that in conjunction with projects for marine science exploration. So essentially we had a target that was undersea based, but we were still using the tools that NASA had developed for this exploration and for scientific sampling, for example. So here we're learning how to identify coral. I can tell you that some of these coral are a lot more difficult to identify than we thought they would be. I think that's probably one of the more challenging tasks that we had. So we all had flashcards around the house. We were making dinner at night. We'd like test each other and make sure that we were learning the coral that we were supposed to be learning. And we got pretty good at it towards the end. So that was just an example of some of the training that we did. We had a couple of delays to the start of the mission, and that was because of weather. They wanted to make sure everything was safe before they sent a lot of the heavy equipment down and the personnel down. So we took a break, we went down to Key West and had some more crew bonding time, and then we came back and we had what's called splashdown, so that's the start of the mission. And so all the crew was joined together and got all the crew photos. Reed's really good at selfies, so we got a couple of crew selfies. But what I like about this is you can see a lot of the other team members that are behind us, and so it definitely takes a village to do this kind of work. It's not just the crew members. We're just kind of at the point of things, but we would not be able to do anything that we did there without all that support behind us. So just some more pictures that we took. This is us swimming down to the habitat with regular scuba gear. We did a crew photo. So that's all of us behind, and the two guys in the front are actually our habitat technicians. So they're the guys who are former Navy divers who essentially kept us alive down there. So they ran the habitat, they made sure all the controls were going, we were breathing the gases we needed to. They kept all of our diving equipment clean and ready to go for the next day. We couldn't do that kind of mission without those guys either. And then this is kind of the mandatory NEEMO crew photo. I think every NEEMO mission has had this picture taken. But you can see the habitat technicians ran inside really quick, got dried off, and threw on their shirts, but they're looking out from our kitchen window. So that's essentially the view that we would have when we were eating breakfast or dinner or working at the table.
Did they live with you in the habitat?
They did. So, and I'm going to tell you about this in a second, why I talked about, so you can have 6 people max in the habitat. So they split our mission up. And so this is very much like a crew handoff, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But it's a great question. So this is all of us. This is just one of my favorite crew photos because it captures all of our crazy personalities. So just one more crew photo. And then we split up, which was really sad after we've all been training together and working together, but we knew that this is going to happen. So what happened was Noel and I came back up, and these 4 went to the habitat and lived with the 2 habitat technicians. So there were 6 people down there. And at 8 days, they decompressed. Megan and Matthias stayed, the 2 on the right, stayed down in the habitat. They pressed them back down, and then Noel and I swam down, and they did a second mission. So essentially, Matthias and Megan did back-to-back 8-day missions with never coming out of the habitat. Reed was the commander for the first 8 days, and then it was a handoff and leadership to Megan for the second 8 days. And so one of the things they wanted to test out and kind of look at was that transfer of commanding, just like they do on the International Space Station. So they kind of wanted to simulate that. They've never done that before with NEEMO, so this is a first. But it was sad. Like, we had all been training together and working together and bonded really well, and then we kind of gave our hugs goodbye, and everybody was like, man, this is a bummer. So they sent this picture to us and said, hey, we're at the habitat. It's like, oh, man. So we had to wait for 8 days. So we went to one of our favorite little restaurants and got really good chocolate croissants, which were not on my diet, by the way, and got some really good drinks and sent this picture back to them to try to rub it in, but I think they still had the better end of the deal at the end of the day. So like I said, there's this handoff in leadership, and so this is just Megan and Reed before Reed came up from his dive. But about 2 days later, Noel and I got to go back down. So, like I said, when you're in that habitat, it's like you're scuba diving. So when we're down there, just regular scuba diving, we have a limitation as far as how long we can stay down there. So we could stay down there for, I think it was an hour max based off of the depth. So we had dry clothes sit down. Noel and I swam down. We met up with our crew. We had to get another crew selfie, of course, inside the habitat with all of us together. And we did some more formal crew photos. Another really cool thing that we got to do during this, though, was a link up to the International Space Station. So we actually got to talk to the astronauts on the International Space Station from undersea. And you saw Kate Rubins in that video. She was a blonde astronaut from NASA. She was on the International Space Station, and she had been a NEEMO aquanaut. Actually, all of the astronauts on the space station at that time had been previous NEEMO aquanauts. And so they knew what we were experiencing. They're floating around the space station with their iPads showing us their view, and as they're passing over the Marshall Islands, and you can see the Soyuz, and we're, behind this iPad, or behind the laptop view that we had watching them, you had fish swimming around in the background, which is just insane. So it was pretty intense, but it was also just really cool to highlight, the technology and where things are. So I had 8 days, Noel had 8 days. We worked on our research projects a fair bit, but one other thing we did was help the support crews. So like I said, there's a lot of support divers in to make sure that the divers are staying safe in the water, to transfer stuff back and forth to the habitat, just a lot of different things. Every day they had probably about 25 to 30 dives going on a day just to kind of maintain things. And so I helped with support diving and Everybody did. Everybody kind of chipped in whenever they got the chance to. And I had to swim by and say hi to my crewmates. So, and I knew that in a couple days I was going to be on the other side of that glass, which is why I was really happy. And so this is my crew. So we finally did the crew switch out. These are the people that I lived with undersea. And again, couldn't have asked for better, especially for living in such small quarters for 8 days. So I've talked about the training. I've talked about why NASA does this. Like I said, we had about 18 mission objectives, about 18 different research projects we were working on. It's really small. It's kind of hard to read here, but essentially it just gives you an idea of how many different tasks we were working on throughout the mission. A lot of these are specific to NASA, to an International Space Station, or long-duration space mission. And so we had to find a way to kind of pull all that together so that everybody could get their tasks accomplished, and all of the sponsors and all the collaborators were going to be happy too. And then this is just an idea of all the different partners that we had working with us. And this is why we had over 150 people from start to finish that were affiliated with the mission. As I mentioned, the makeshift mission control. So this is mission control. They're going through an end-of-day briefing. They're going over what was done that day and planning tasks for the next day. So you have 4 crew members who are in there, and they are trying to work through all these different objectives, just like the astronauts on the space station. So interesting enough, the astronauts, I think somebody was saying that for a 6-month International Space Station mission, they have like 150 research objectives when they're up there, which is just insane. So one of the things, though, you're trying to do all these tasks, and everybody has their time management things and also space management, just so you're not stepping on each other's toes trying to get all this stuff done. And so they were planning things out so that we could get our tasks done without getting in each other's way and get it done safely. You can see that they're looking at this kind of screen in the background that looks like a timeline or like an Excel spreadsheet. So essentially, just like the astronauts, we use this thing called the timeline, or playbook timeline. And essentially, they task us from the time we wake up in the morning. We have about an hour, about from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. We have about an hour to ourselves to kind of get ready for the day. And then from 7 a.m. to about 8 p.m., we're theirs. And then we do whatever they want. And so they have our day blocked off the entire time they have us working on some kind of task, just like they do in the space station again. So one of the interesting things about this, so each of these blocks you see are different tasks that a certain crewmate was supposed to be working on. That red line down the middle is actually the actual time. So you always want to stay ahead of that red line. You start to fall behind, that affects your day, but it also affects your crewmates. So that you're starting to affect the efficiency of everybody around you as well. You might be getting in their way. So there's that psychological pressure that's included in this, of just that time pressure. You're always having to stay on task. You can never just sit back and go, like, okay, I just want to watch a pretty fish for a little while. You have to stay on task. And the astronauts will tell you this is one of the biggest psychological pressures that they face in space, because 6 days a week they are on a timeline like this. And they have one day off where they can do whatever they want, essentially. But, I mean, they stay busy. And so that was really interesting to experience that. And for the astronauts to say this is probably the most realistic exposure that they had experienced as far as what they experienced in space because of this psychological tasking. And I mentioned the communications. So we had the mission control talking to the intravehicular communications, and then IV communications, so inside the habitats talking to the divers on the outside. So it's the same communication loops that we see for space as well. So we're trying to keep all that simulated to be very similar to the space operation. So EVA objectives. So these are objectives that we did during our simulated spacewalks or ocean walks or water walks. So I was talking about testing out some of these tools that they've developed. So one thing they've developed is an iPad device and software that allows them to follow tasking. So as I mentioned, we have these different mission objectives. You can't possibly remember all the details of sampling coral or sampling marine geology specimens. So essentially we can go through and say, okay, this is where we're at, this is what we're looking for, click on that, okay, now this is how we sample that, this is how they want the samples to look and how they want them packaged and processed. And so it helps us kind of stay on track and not have to remember all the little details when we're also trying to keep track of just staying alive when we're out there doing our dives. So we're doing this in collaboration with a couple of projects, like I said, the Marine Science Project, where we're looking at coral, and also the Marine Geology Project, where we're collecting marine geology samples. This is another study that we did where we were looking at human-robot interaction in the water. And so that's actually me diving support. You can see the aquanaut in the background who's sampling coral. But they have the robots set up, and they're moving more towards the robots, using them as a tool for carrying, different specimens or carrying samples that you've collected, or helping you, provide you tools that you need to do the tasking that you need to do. and also cameras. So it's giving feedback to the science team as it kind of hovers over your shoulder to see what you're doing. So they're working more on this kind of human-robot interaction. So there's interest on the Navy side of things with this, and that's specifically who is funding this research, but there's also interest on the NASA side of this for spacewalks down the line. And just more sampling tools and more technology that I was talking about just gives you another good picture of all the different tools that we're working with to do the sampling that we had to do. And these are marine geology sampling tools, but similar to kits that they're developing for planetary exploration and sampling. This is the coral restoration project that I was talking about, and these are what the coral trees look like. So since we build them out of PVC piping, each of those cards that you see are those coral seedlings I was talking about. In about 6 months, they grow big enough where they can harvest them and then replant them elsewhere. So this next mission, I'm going to guess they're going to go back and harvest them and start working on trying to rebuild some of these coral communities. But they were using our mission to do these deep, because on a regular scuba dive, you'd be limited to how long you could stay at 100 feet. So we were out building these at 100 feet. So we built the deepest coral nurseries ever. Like, you know, I don't think we have much competition with that, but, but it's kind of a claim to fame that we can carry with us. And so I talked about the marine sampling and some of the marine science sampling. So these are some of the coral species that we had to sample. So essentially what we were testing out for NASA on this was how the tasking went. So if they were on Mars and saw something that they wanted to sample, but the astronauts aren't sure if that's exactly what the scientists want, because they're not scientists themselves, you know, they're just out there kind of collecting the samples. You put down temporary tags to say, hey, maybe this is of interest, we're going to send all this information back to you, we'll send images back to you, you tell us if you want this or not. So we were testing out 2 different ways of looking at this. One was that you could get real-time information back from the science team. I didn't throw this in there, but one other way that they simulated long-duration space missions is they added in a 15-minute comm delay. So our communication out to mission control or to the science teams was delayed 15 minutes, and their communication back was 15 minutes. So you're doing a 6-hour excursion, you have a half-hour time delay. It makes it interesting, but they wanted to try to simulate, you know, real time if you're talking about mission control versus somebody on the surface of Mars. And so they did this. So one thing is, you know, can we get this information back to them? They make decisions and we sample during the dive itself. Or do they make the decision overnight and then have the next team who goes in do that sampling and just get a feel for us what felt better for us and get feedback from the crew members and also from the science team about what was most efficient. So we're doing this in collaboration with this marine science project for Florida International. And this is just a picture. So, you know, the next day Reed was told, go sample this coral. This is how you do it. He used that technology that showed him how to sample that coral. And then he went in with a drill and collected the samples that the marine science team wanted. We tested optical communications. So this is a big issue, especially on the Navy side of things, is trying to relay any kind of communications in the water. And so they were testing out these optical communications, this optical communication technology that's been developed by a company that's in affiliation with Embry-Riddle University in Florida. And so they're just looking at optimal distances with the technology that they developed. We have a little tiny bit of free time to have some fun. And you take it all in, right? You have amazing, just beautiful sights. You're walking on this coral that's like above your shoulders, just towering over you and just taking everything in. This is actually a school of bait fish. And so Megan said, put your camera down and I'll get a video of you walking through the bait pond. So luckily a giant predator didn't come and join us. So and I was actually going, oh! So this is having a little bit of fun. So interior objectives. So this is working inside the habitat itself. We did a lot of different things. So these spacewalks, these simulated spacewalks lasted from 4 to 6 hours. As I mentioned, it was about an hour prep time, an hour downtime, or hour kind of breakdown time. But if you weren't doing a dive, or if you weren't doing a dive on a specific day, or when you weren't doing a dive on a dive day, you were doing interior objectives. So you're working on stuff inside the habitat. And so just examples of some things that we worked on. So this is a medical telemetry study that we were looking at, relaying medical information back to a team of medical doctors that were at mission control. And we were doing that both morning and evening. All of us would do that. So they could kind of look at how that information was relayed and decisions that they could make based off of what they were capturing from us. So this is, like I said, this is something that we all did every day, twice a day. This is actually my study, and so this is where I was looking at molecular level changes that occur in response to living in an environment like NEEMO. And so my background, I've done a lot of work in genetics and decompression sickness that I was talking about with the bubbles and the blood and tissues and divers. And I look at genetics and molecular level changes that occur in response to a lot of these extreme environments. So one of the questions is, how do our genes change and how they're expressed? And are there permanent changes? So are there permanent changes to how our genes are expressed? These are called epigenetic changes. Are there changes to telomeres? So these are the caps at the ends of our chromosomes that get shorter as we age. Do they shorten in response to living in a high-stress environment like NEEMO? And then we also looked at gut microbiome. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the gut microbiome. It's kind of a hot area of research now. But essentially for every human cell in our body, they estimate there are about 10 bacterial cells in our body. So essentially we're walking vessels of bacteria. So what we want to look at is in an extreme environment like this, do those gut bacteria change in response to that stress? So we know that things like diet and exercise and stress and all different types of environmental exposures change your gut bacteria. So does living in this environment like NEEMO change your gut makeup? And all of that drives things like your cognitive abilities and your overall health. So this is just kind of a start in looking at yes or no, do things change? And this is of interest specifically to the Navy. So this is a Navy-funded study, but NASA's also looking at similar things in response to living in space. We looked at vestibular function and balance. So this is a kind of a fun study because we did it before the mission started for a baseline a couple times. We did it during the mission, I think every other day or so, and there's a series of tasks that we had to do. And essentially, they've developed a mobile unit that assesses vestibular function. And so this is specific to NASA, to the astronauts. When they land, they have issues with their balance and with their vestibular function. So is there a way that they can assess this both in space, but also after they land without having to go through extensive battery testing? And so we all did this. You can see Megan doing the arms crossed, heel to toe walk. We also had to do that with our eyes closed several times. And what was funny is with the eyes closed, a lot of us tended to veer left and hit the refrigerator. And it turns out the habitat's on a tilt. So I'm not sure how they're going to incorporate that into the data analysis, but we figured that out kind of the hard way with a few bumps and bruises. This is probably one of our favorite intravehicular mission objectives, and this is the DNA extraction and sequencing that I was talking about. And so that's me extracting DNA from a sample. So essentially we got to pick a sample in the habitat, or pick a spot in the habitat to sample, swab it down, extract the DNA out of it, and then sequence that DNA to see what kind of bacteria we had captured in our sample. So NASA so essentially, I'm not sure how many of you have worked with a DNA sequencer, but it's about the size of this podium. So this sequencer that we have is about the size of your palm. It fits in the palm of your hand. It's amazing. It doesn't give you the fidelity that you would get in some of these larger sequencers, but it would give you the information that you need as far as what kind of bacteria you're looking at. Right now in space, if they want to sample something for bacteria, they culture the samples. They actually grow out the old school cultures, which is fine, but it's not really safe, and it's time consuming and everything else. This takes about 6 hours, and you know what you have. And so I say that it's actually about overnight because it has to run overnight, but it's about 6 hours for the protocol, and then you get the answer the next day. So we did this extraction and sequencing. That's the actual sequencer itself that he's loading, that Noel's loading. And it became a little bit of a competition, one on who got the best reads and got the best results, but also we kept talking about who's going to find the new species of bacteria, because you think about a habitat in that environment like NEMO, there's probably there's probably a very unique exposure where you probably have some interesting evolution that occurs with species like bacteria. So we're figuring out, do bacteria change or could they evolve? If they evolve and we found a new species, who are we going to name it after? So that's the new competition. And actually, Kate Rubens, who you saw in that first video with the blonde hair, she is a molecular biologist by trade. She's actually trained at Stanford and had a lab at Stanford. And she was doing the same thing in space. So we were the first ones to sequence DNA undersea. She was the first to sequence DNA in space right after us, about a month after us. So it's pretty exciting. We tested out technology that's looking at tasking. So if you're working on a very complex task that has a lot of different instructions, you're always like doing the task and you look up, and you're doing the task and you look up. This essentially is technology that reads out the tasking to you and follows you in the tasking so that you don't have to keep looking up, and it makes your working through the task much more efficient. We looked at different types of nutritional assessment tools, and this was for the European Space Agency, which was interesting because they would tell us, you need to eat more of X or Y. And it's like, yeah, we'd love to. If you'd send it down to us, we'd be happy to do that. But we were pretty much eating camping food throughout most of the mission. And this is the miniature exercise device 2.0. This is actually on the space station now. But they're actually hooking it up and putting it together with a Run Social app. So the astronauts, when they're in space, can do their workouts and compete against a family member or a friend or a colleague, which one pushes them competitively, but also gives them that social interaction. So we were testing that out. We looked at the Microsoft HoloLens for packing and unpacking, which is now used in the space station, but they had made some upgrades, so we were just testing that out. That's me doing some swabbing for environmental contamination. This is a tool that was developed by the European Space Agency. And that's just an example. So at the end of all this, we get to come up. As I mentioned, it takes about 15 hours to come up. And so that's everybody doing their oxygen decompression. So everybody had to lay in bed with a mask on, breathing pure oxygen. And the reason we were in bed is that when you're breathing high pressure oxygen, you have a risk of developing seizures. And so they didn't want anybody hitting their head or doing it. If they went to a seizure, they wanted them as safe as possible. So we're all in our bunks. We're reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is actually the most tweeted picture I think they said a NEEMO mission has ever had. And then we did about 15 hours of decompression. So essentially what happened is they closed off the habitat so that we were now locked in and we weren't exposed to the outside pressure. And they slowly reduced the pressure inside of that chamber itself. So then it became like a hyperbaric chamber or a hypobaric chamber. And they reduced the pressure overnight slowly. And when we woke up the next morning, we were at 1 atmosphere. So just like we are here, just like you would be in a submarine. So we're still at the bottom of the ocean, but now we're protected from that outside pressure. And they spent about an hour just making sure that everybody's okay, there aren't any symptoms, there's nothing wonky going on. And then they pressed us back down to 45 feet, and they opened up that door, because now we're equilibrated, and we swam out in our scuba gear. So that's actually the last picture that I got of the habitat before I hopped back on the boat, saying goodbye to my home. And as I mentioned, we could not do this without the collaboration of all these different researchers. These are just as many people as we could fit on the boat that day. It's actually everybody who was on site that day when we did the picture, but it just gives you an idea of how many moving parts of people there are in a mission like that. With that, any questions? So she asked about the DNA sequencing, and so for my specific study or for the DNA sequencing study, so like the sequencer? Okay. Yep, so for my project specifically, we actually don't have the results yet because we're going to compare them to some results from this year's mission. So we're going to try to, we have everything extracted, but we're going to run everything together essentially because we wanted a higher N. We only had an N of 8 essentially for the study that we're doing. So we want to try to up that a little bit before we do the analysis. One thing we did find is that the telomere length that I talked about, they did run those studies, and it turns out that the telomeres did shorten statistically significantly. So we did age over the course of the NEEMO mission. So now they're looking at longer range samples to say, does that reverse in any way? And probably not. So it's probably just damage that we did to our bodies living in that environment. And they're also looking at some technology that reverses telomere shortening and actually helps telomeres grow again. So obviously they're not giving it to us, but they're putting it into the blood samples they collected from us to see if it has any effect on telomere length. So, but hopefully something will be published here in the next year or so from the combined studies. Thank you. Yep, in yellow.
Will you be writing a book about what you're doing?
I never thought about that. It's funny because I'm surrounded by people who do space shuttle missions and International Space Station, but I have not thought about writing a book. So.
When you had to carry the swim fins to go to the bathroom, how were the fish attacking you?
Because they know that you're releasing things that they want to eat, essentially. So, yeah. So that it's, and also I think they're friendly anyway because they're familiar with us being around the habitat, and they're kind of territorial as well. But part of it is that they actually eat what you're putting out into the ocean. So I'm glad so you saw where the shower was in that front room where all the equipment was. That's where the toilet was as well. So I'll tell you that the previous aquanauts that we talked to, so you're officially an aquanaut after you've been in saturation for 24 hours, so we were all aquanauts. And actually, Megan and Reed became the 50th and 51st aqua astronauts. So they've both been in space and undersea, so that was pretty cool. But the previous aquanauts were giving us a hard time saying, you're not a real aquanaut unless you use the gazebo outside. We're like, we will redefine what aquanaut means if that's necessary, but we're not using that thing. So, yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So she was asking about the new administration. It'll be really interesting. So I know that there's been a shift to push towards getting man to the moon, and I know that from what I've heard so far. So I think with that, there's a big push for exploration, which is fantastic. And if that's the case, then it looks like there'll be some decent funding in place, hopefully, for not just the engineering aspect of things, but also on the human biomedical side of things as well.
So what,
Yeah, next.
I have 3 questions.
Okay.
One was, storms affected you down there. How did you process oxygen and water?
Okay, so they had so the questions were, how did storms affect us, and how do we process oxygen and water? So they had a water like reclaim system in there, and they had CO2 scrubbers in there, so they scrubbed out the carbon dioxide that we were breathing out, and they monitored all the levels of the gases that were in there and kept fresh air pumped in there as needed. So, but the habitat technicians kept an eye on all that, and the watch desk. So all that information is also relayed back to the watch desk on land to make sure that everything is safe. And as far as storms, they did definitely affect. One thing is the habitat would actually rock if we had high enough swells. So that was a little interesting because you remembered where you were. You remember you're sitting at the bottom of the ocean, because I remember a couple nights we had a few storms come through and you could feel the whole habitat rocking on the bottom, and your ears would pop. So that was interesting for that vestibular balance testing that we were doing. If we had rocky, wavy days, it would definitely affect our balance just because our ears are constantly popping and we're constantly clearing. So you could definitely tell. And also communications. A lot of times our communication would drop out, and we would go for stretches where we didn't have that communication, or it was really broken up back to mainland. So good question. Yeah. So how did I get involved in this project? So I was a professional diver for about a decade and a half before I ever got into doing research itself. And so I had that operational experience. And then part of the thing about working in those projects is that you have a lot of questions when you see your colleagues get things like decompression sickness that I talked about, or this oxygen toxicity that I talked about. So, but there were a lot more questions than answers, and so I started asking questions about it, which turned into me going to the Navy with a project, and it got funded. And so then I actually went to Duke, and I said, I have money, can I go to grad school here? Which I joked that they wouldn't have taken me otherwise, but I turned that project into my PhD project, and then kind of came in that back way. But I always, if I can, I always want to keep my hand in that operational environment, because I think talking to people who are actually doing it and experiencing it, they're going to give you so much incredible feedback as far as what they're experiencing versus, reading things in a book or reading it in the lab. So it's nice to be able to pull all that together. Yep.
I'm curious about the gas mix in the air that they were using, particularly in relation to the decompression. I wonder if you know if there's been any work done trying mixing other gases that maybe the body wouldn't absorb as much as CO2.
That's a great question. So we just used air for our mission, and that's based off of what our needs were, and it's just safer and cleaner. Commercial divers, I didn't mention this earlier, but the saturation diving that I've talked about, it's heavily used in the commercial diving industry and also military diving industry. And so they do use different gases for that, and they tend to use helium, but it's not specifically because of, part of that's inert gas uptake and elimination, so essentially you can get rid of the helium faster than you can with the nitrogen, but also the narcotic effect. So with nitrogen, the deeper you go, you get what's called Martini's Law. So the deeper you go, you get kind of, a little woozy and get a little silly, and to the point where if you get deep enough, it can cloud your judgment, or you can even black out if it gets bad enough. And so, especially the deep dives that the military does, they use helium to replace that, because helium does not have the same narcotic effect, but it does have what we call on-gassing and off-gassing properties that are beneficial as well. It is a shorter overall decompression with helium, yes. Yes?
when you were a child, were you interested in science, or did something click? At what point did you go, science is for me?
When I was pretty young, so I collected fossils and rocks and read geology books. I think it was just when I had parents that were just really supportive of me being curious, And I just always had that. One of my favorite games I played with my dad when I was little was the why game. So he would say something, it's like, well, why is that? And then he would give me an answer, it's like, well, why is that? And I just keep going until it's like, would you stop asking me questions? But I think I've always kind of had that. And I wanted to irritate him, but I also wanted to know. So, but then I moved to North Carolina from Iowa and got to see the ocean. And I'd seen it before, but not to the point that I could appreciate it to that degree. And I was like, I want to be a marine biologist. So then I started carrying around these giant Jacques Cousteau books. My parents bought them for me for Christmas. They're like that big in my backpack, and I would read them front to cover. And I knew that I had to get scuba certified to do what I did. And so I jumped around. I was like, oh, I want to do marine biology. I want to do geology. I jumped all over the place, even through high school and even through college, actually. I changed my degree 3 times in undergrad. But I knew that there was just that curiosity. To get paid to ask questions and find the answers is pretty cool. So, yep.
So when you were doing the DNA sampling on the bacteria,
Mm-hmm.
you have a picture of the guy over here.
Yeah.
Did you find a new evolved bacteria? Where were you doing the sampling? Was that inside the habitat or outside?
It was inside the habitat. So, for example, I picked behind the trash can. Other people picked the toilet. Other people picked. So we were just sampling. It could have been anything. So essentially, it was just more, can we extract that, and then what do we find in the samples? It's more of a feasibility thing than an actual study of can you find new bacteria. But then we started joking, and actually they agreed. There's a good chance you actually could find new bacteria. So the arms in the air were because it worked, because as you know, or I don't know if you do DNA sequencing or DNA extraction, but it's a tedious process. Like I said, it takes about 6 hours and is about 25 pages of step-by-step protocols. So if you miss, I think the first person who did it actually missed one of the steps in the protocol, and so he didn't get reads, and so it didn't work. He actually went back and did it again, and it worked, so that was good. But so Reed was the first one who got successful reads, so it was a big victory. But as far as what we were looking at, it'll just be interesting to see what we find. We think we may have found something new, but that will be, essentially they're going to follow up with samples that were collected in conjunction with the samples that we processed, and those were sent back to the surface to test in, one, the sequencer on the surface to see if there was a pressure effect on what we found in the sequencer at depth, and then also to test it with an actual full-scale sequencer to find if there's any difference in the results. So it'll be interesting, because I think we'll find that out this year, and hopefully.
And you mentioned that growing it in culture was obviously longer but more dangerous. Is
Yeah.
that because you're multiplying it?
Yeah, you're multiplying, and just the potential contamination and the enclosed airspace, and also the resources that you need to be able to culture bacterial samples is going to be a lot more than if you could have a small area and a tiny little sequencer in hand. Yep. Great question. Yes?
What came up of any variation that you found within the gut bacteria?
So we don't have the results from that yet. So we processed everything so they can run those. They're going to run them after this next mission. So, so one of my colleagues does work on nutrition and diet, and so he's collecting the same gut samples from the crew this upcoming mission, and then we're going to run them together. So we have a bigger N. That's the biggest thing, is we wanted to do that and not have any issue with batch effect too. So, yes.
Can you describe how it works going from when you're in the water and then you go into the habitat? Obviously, you've got all this equipment on, and how do you go from the water to the inside the habitat? How does that all work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, sorry I haven't been repeating every question. So she was asking about transitioning from doing a dive outside in the water to getting back into the habitat. You have all the equipment on. You have those habitat technicians, in particular the big strapping guy, Hank. He's standing over there, and he's a former Navy diver. So this is what these guys do. They come out and they strip you down, essentially. They get all the gear off of you. But you climb up in, you turn around. He gets that helmet off first thing, because it's not really comfortable out of the water. And then they help you get out of everything else. And then one thing is that as we're in the water and then going back into the habitat, regardless of what you were doing, you always had to shower before you went in, because they didn't want any salt water inside the habitat. So then you slide into the shower, get rinsed off, and then hopefully if you have good crewmates, they had hot tea waiting for you. So, yes.
What was the average time you spent in the water every day? You said 12 hours per day, but I'm sure some of that was prep work and everything within that parameter.
So
What was the actual time?
the actual dives themselves, so going out the door and then coming back in, usually ran from about 4.5 to 6 hours. So I said 4 to 6. It's usually 4.5 to 6 hours. I would say on average 5 hours. And part of that was, like I said, the prepping and everything to get in is about an hour lead up, and then breaking down and everything. You had about an hour on the other side to kind of come down off the dive, and you're tired. I mean, it's a lot of work. Yeah, it was a lot of work, so we're definitely really tired, and get some food in you and everything, get some good nutrition. But what's interesting is that if you're efficient and doing everything right, they're like, hey, could you do some more tasks? And they say they do this on the space station too, because it's like, hey, you're getting stuff done, now can we add this other task on? And so, of course, you want to do the best for your team, so you say yes, and so you end up out there for some long dives. But they're pretty cozy. I mean, the water's warm, I mean, you're pretty comfortable, you're just tired at the end of them, so. Yes?
Just simply amazing. My question to you is, how often do you do this? Is it a year-long thing, or do you have starting time when you go to habitat?
Yeah, so your question is how long do we do this and how often? So they do this mission every year. They do this mission once a year, and it's usually, so for me personally, this is the first mission I ever worked with. I'll be going back this year, but I'm going to go back as a support. So I'll be back there to support fellow researchers and also to support on the diving side of things, and just to see some of my old teammates, not the crewmates, but some of my old teammates again. And, but yeah, they run this once a year. We're down there for anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. Like ours was a little different because it was a 16-day mission total with all the crew training, and then we had the delay in mission. So we were down there a little bit longer, but it usually takes up about like half a month to a month or so of time there, plus about a week of training at Johnson Space Center in Houston. Yes? This mission, she asked when the mission started, so this mission actually was, boy, good question. We started early July, and we finished up in August, about mid-August. Oh, sorry, it started in 2000, so they started doing this in 2000. Yeah, 17 years, but some of those years they've done multiple missions, so this is the 21st successful mission. They've all been successful, but the 21st mission that they've completed. You're welcome. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn. So thank you all for coming very much, and we'll be heading out. If you have any last questions, you want to say hi to Dawn on the way out, please feel free. Thank you so much again.